Welcome to the Iyun Podcast, an in-depth look at Haredi society, Israel, and the Jewish people. I am your host, Ari Koretsky, and I invite you to join us as we confront the challenges, joys, and possibilities of Torah-centered living in an evolving world. The Iyun Podcast. Think again. Welcome back, friends. Recently, in a Jewish publication, I'm not going to mention which one or who authored a particular article I'm about to reference, but an op-ed was published in which, incidentally, the figure of how many from people reside in Eretz Yisrael was referenced. And subsequently, there was quite an uproar because that figure, it turned out, had actually been the number of Haredi Jews living in Israel and did not include the many, well over 1 million in the Dati Leumi sector. Now, the Dati Leumi sector is extremely broad and diverse, and what many of our listeners may not realize is that there is an entire subset of that community, large community, in which Torah study and general mitzvah observance, for that matter, is taken very, very seriously. There are certainly cultural differences from the Haredi world, and there are ideological distinctions that are very important to understand, not to gloss over, to really evaluate and analyze. However, there is a whole world in Israel of young men, we're focusing right now on men, who are deeply entrenched in the world of the Beis Medrash, deeply committed to halacha in all of its particulars, and we do a disservice to the conversations that we're having about army conscription and about Israel and religion in general when we fail to acknowledge this incredibly developed, sophisticated, vibrant subset of the Jewish people living in Israel. And so I wanted to bring on an English-speaking representative, so to speak, and he's not a formal representative in any official capacity. Let me make that very clear. But Rabbi Moshe Tarragon is a wonderful Rosh Yeshiva, a Ram, a Rebbe in Yeshivat Har Etzion, colloquially known as the Gush. He's been there for many years. He studied under the great Rav Aaron Lichtenstein Zatzal and the great Rav Amital Zatzal, and he imbibed their Hashkafas Achayim and has firmly ensconced himself and raised his family within this Dati Chazak Torani community. We asked Rabbi Tarragon to describe what this community looks like from the inside, the various substrata therein, its strengths, areas where it could learn from the more right-wing yeshivish elements. You'll find Rabbi Tarragon is a voice of unbridled Avos Yisrael, a gentle optimism, I would call it, in that he's deeply committed to the unfolding process of Geula for our people, not in a fanatically, overly confident or predictive sense, but as an expression of our Masorah. And yet he's also a realist, understands the very painful challenges that our nation is facing, that his own family faces, as they participate so directly in this literal battle for the state of Israel and for Am Yisrael in Israel and around the world. I hope that people will listen carefully to Rabbi Tarragon's voice of humility blended with wisdom and a great deal of warmth as well. He has a lot to say and a lot to offer all of us, regardless of the specific community in which we situate ourselves and from which we choose to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now to our conversation with Rabbi Moshe Tarragon. We are here with Rabbi Moshe Tarragon from Yeshivat Har Etzion, the Gush, and coming to us to share some really unique and interesting perspectives today on our ongoing series, what we've been talking about. I think an aspect of religious society worldwide and certainly in Israel that is quite underappreciated, and hopefully we'll get to appreciate it a little bit here today and beyond. But first of all, Rabbi Tarragon, how are you?
It's a good question. When you ask an Israeli that question this year, it has to be qualified and has to be sensitive. And part of what this war has challenged us is for people to be sensitive to where people are, both sides. Let's see a lot of Israelis who aren't able to appreciate how deeply invested Americans are. And that investment is emotional and existential and financial. It may not be military. You're not picking up arms and serving alongside of us, but I know you're losing sleep and you're crying. So I've tried to create that bridge where people on this end of the ocean appreciate how deeply committed and how deeply codependent we are. Of course, when you're asking Israeli that question, we're still fighting a war. And my sense is just picking up from people already on vacation and July 4th and summer vacations and cottages. And here, my kids are still in the army and we're still checking the news. Unfortunately, today, one of my talmidim in yeshiva came over and said that a lot of the boys will not be in shir tomorrow. I teach a fourth-year Israeli shir as well, because one of their comrades, not from yeshiva, was just announced as dead, killed, and they're about to put it out for public information, but he wanted to give me a heads up that there'd be a spark shir tomorrow. So, Baruch Hashem, it's 3 weeks, and we're thinking about Gula, not just about Galus, and we're hoping for Siyat L'Shmai, Kerevayim.
Amen. And you mentioned to me previously, or as we were speaking off air before, that you're finishing up a sefer on the topic of Geula and how it can resonate, let's say, with wide swaths of Torah observant people, and maybe outside of those who typically associate themselves with the quote unquote messianic camps of the Frum society. So maybe we'll get to touch on that as well. So give us quickly just a brief overview of your own sort of life trajectory in terms of where you grew up and where you learned and how you kind of ended up where you are today. And then we'll try to sketch out what's obviously not a monolithic subsect of Torah society, but is kind of its own distinctive population, and try to give people a broad panoramic view of, what is out there on the current landscape today. But start with your kind of where you came from.
Okay. Thank you. But first of all, to be polite, thank you for having me, for hosting me. It's nice to meet you. If we'll meet in person, Mizrat Hashem, one day, hopefully standing in Yerushalayim.
Amen.
Hashem Yisrael in Van. Mizrat Hashem, we should return to Neve Kachecha. If not, then in Baltimore, Eric Kodesh, or here your roots as I do. I don't like talking about myself, but you put me on the spot and have to be a gracious guest. Try not to direct attention about yourself. In the age of Facebook and promotion and trying to solicit likes, that's the new frontier of tznius. Tznius isn't how long your hemline is, and it's not just for women. It's, you don't talk about Yosef and Israel. You keep quiet, you keep to yourself, and you keep close to the Eibishter that way. But look at tznius are given b'tzina, and they were in Amrit V'Kayim. But for the sake of people who may be listening to this, I did grow up in more of a yeshivish setting. I went to a high school called Kamenetz. For the Baltimore listeners, I almost attended Ner Yisrael. My father attended. I went to visit, but it was a question of not wanting to go. I grew up in New York. I did receive values, commitment to Talmud Torah, intensity, piety that I deeply value. It didn't sit well in my own heart. I felt a little bit of dissonance between the type of chinuch I was receiving and more or less my home. My home was, I don't like labeling, but it wasn't a yeshivish home. It was more what you would call a young Israel home, middle of the road. My father lived in Ner Yisrael, but so there was a little bit of dissonance. I went to Camp Monks and dyed in the blue Camp Monk product. And then just by chance or hashkacha, after high school, because I knew friends that went to Hezder Yeshivos, so I ended up going to a Hezder Yeshiva. And I ended up choosing Gush because I heard about Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. And that was the transformative moment of my life. I came into contact with two people who were absolute giants. And I thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu every day for giving me 25 and 32 years, respectively, because they really changed my life in many ways. Many listeners will have heard of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. There's Talmud Muvak of Soloveitchik, who married his daughter. Fewer would have heard of Rav Amital, who was, maybe we'll talk about him later, one of the pioneering people of the Hesed movement, one of the most influential religious figures in the 20th century evolution of the state of Israel and the Orthodox society. And then I was deeply influenced. I fell into the YU orbit. I went back and went by Soloveitchik, met his Hamidim, with Schechter, but Willig. And then I made Aliyah in 1993 with my family. And I've been here in Gush Etzion since then, teaching in a Hesder Yeshiva called Yeshivat Har Etzion, the Gush Yeshiva. I teach Americans, I teach Israelis. I try to write and report just to share ideas with the broader public, the broader audience. That's a quick bio.
Now, were you cognizant at the time when you were going, maybe not when you were choosing to go to the Gush, but when you were there and once you were kind of in the orbit, were you cognizant, self-conscious of the fact that there was a different hashkafa on some aspects being promoted? Were you tussling or wrestling with some of those issues directly, or is it more kind of as osmotic in terms of how you ended up sort of evolving your own personal positions on Yiddishkeit?
It wasn't a struggle. It wasn't this great existential clash like people talk about, the clash of two worlds that creates electric sparks of creativity and shapes a human soul. It's more like being at home, like slipping your foot into an old slipper. The slipper fits, it's comfortable. This is more or less what I've seen at home. It's more or less what was in my heart. To be quite honest, and I'm not going to mention the Haredi high school, the Yeshivish high school I went to, it was a flawed Yeshivish high school. So part of how I was scarred by that experience was not necessarily based on the Yeshivish ideology and its limitations, but based on the malfunctions of a particular institution, which was you never judge a movement or an ideology about a particular institution or person. But I certainly walked out of high school feeling lonely, homeless, anchorless, and walking into the yeshiva. This is my place. This is my makom. This is my makom. These are the people I want to learn from. My heart open, my neshama open. There's nothing like as a rebbe when I see a boy finding rebbeim in context that really fits who they are, and they throw down all the shields and all the walls, and their hearts are open, and you feel like Hashkini Mai. Just give me your Masara, give me your ideas. The clay keyboard, we call that in education, in English, the buy-in. It's so important. The higher the buy-in, the greater the progress. Very little to do with the traction and the background, how much mileage. Growth in yeshiva, as you know, is so exponential that boys can recover lost months and days, and lost years and months. Question of drive, motivation, and investment in buy-in. So for me, the buy-in was very high. That became my world. It became my place.
Have you maintained contacts, relationships with members of the more right-wing or the more Haredi society over the years? I mean, famously, Rav Lichtenstein himself was very, very close to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And did you ever have the potential or opportunity to connect with any of those kinds of figures, or in the years since?
A little bit. I don't pursue it actively because I feel it'll be fake and artificial. Just to pursue someone because I want to create an ideological bridge. I feel like that would cheapen my interest. If people come into my world naturally, a family, Eretz Yisrael, or part of the Haredi Welt, I still have many friends that I'm in touch with, but I never created institutional or ideological bridges. There's a fellow who used to write for Mishpacha magazine, Rabbi Jonathan Rosenblum.
Sure, so, he'll be on the program pretty soon.
we were once actually invited to South Africa to this major event to debate religious Zionism versus Haredim, and I forget who spoke first, but he spent 15 minutes praising the community I live in. Then I spent 15 minutes praising the community he lives in. And the moderator said, we didn't fly to South Africa for a love affair. We didn't start arguing and bickering.
And I think, did you not do the same thing in Rabbi Howard's shul in Baltimore at one point? I think the two of you had a similar kind of panel where you extolled the virtues of the other community.
I'm sure it ended in a similar manner. I put it this way. To create bridges presumes or implies divisions. And it's more natural to just assume that Amech Kulam Sadiqim, we're all living together trying to find HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There is no mind that's capable of fully encompassing the Ribono Shel Olam. They tell me, if any Rebbe ever uses the following word, you should walk out the door. If any Rebbe says this is the emes, it's not just morally offensive, it's theologically bankrupt. There's no one person that can encompass Ribono Shel Olam. It sounds like paganism. You're shrinking him to a human size. Rebbe says this is my emes. And under this is my emes, and my Masar, I want to come here. Same thing with Talmud Torah. This is the Derech Halimud. I learned in the Brisker Derech, trained by Rav Lichtenstein, by Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Elchanan, and these are the day-to-day people in my life when I'm learning. I hardly learn Marshas, because the Marsha's position in the Sugya doesn't necessarily enhance or cohere Reb Chaim's approach to the Sugya. But if the Marsha walked into the room right now, I would roll in his dust because he knew more Torah in the white of his little pinky than I'll ever know. I just don't have the time and resources to read every Marsha. I wish I could. So if a Rebbe says, this is a derech to learn a Sugya, there is no derech, 1,000 drachim to learn Sugya. This is my derech. This is, given the limited time we have, the best derech. I just feel like it would cheapen the way I view other Yidden and other Ovei Hashem by trying to create bridges as if there's a gap. You assume there's a gap and the gap widens. If you're just more nonchalant about it, and whoever comes into your world naturally, Makabel Legvam and Sefer Panim Yapos, and Chavar Ani L'Chol Shei Yerucha, you're a Chavar to anyone that's Reish Shamayim. I think it's more organic and it's more real. So I haven't gone out of my way to say, I have Rolodex with 15 contacts. It doesn't suit me.
I guess the alternative way of looking at it would be that, life is sort of dominated by entropy. And to the degree that we don't build connections with people, the connections either deteriorate or never exist to begin with. And so it takes a certain active, intentional mindset if you're not otherwise living among a group of people, to create those connections. And otherwise, it's sort of the gaps emerge organically because people just assume, to use the modern parlance, we other each other, automatically just because we live in different communities. So sometimes intentionally reaching out can just, be a way of counterbalancing that.
I think it's a fair point. I think it's a fair point, especially in Eretz Yisrael, because sadly, this segregation and the dichotomization and the cellularization here is so sharp because of where we live and because of how we vote. Demography and voting and serving in the army, those three. If you're living in America, you more or less can glide or surf over all the shuls you'd like to be part of and all the schools and all the people. And you see each other in the grocery shop and you all have one kosher place you shop in. Everything is cantonized demographically. I live in a lone shvut. Sadly, very sadly to me, there are no Haredim that live here. I wish it weren't true, but these are the realities. Every couple of years when you vote, you have to peg yourself and tag yourself. And then at 17, you have to make a life decision that hopefully doesn't shape your identity, because your identity is not a function of your ideology. Your identity is your identity, but it will determine which framework you'll operate in. Whether you will be in the army, won't be in the army. I think it's a valid point. I'd rather be more natural and holistic rather than more proactive and initiating. I just feel like, to me at least, it's disrespectful to people. It's almost like my kids, and like what you said, my kids go to a very special high school here, called Makor Chaim.
A singer, sure.
Amazing person. So they have every year, not just in that high school, they have Shavua Charedim, where they go and spend time with Charedim. And I understand that, but it strikes me as if a field trip to the zoo to watch the penguins engage.
It's tokenizing in a way.
Belittling. So anyway, but I understand your point.
Yeah, I can hear both sides, as is often the case. So you live in a lone shvut and you've been associated with this world. So if you can sort of broadly speaking sketch out what is the sort of the pathway, the trajectory for a young man, we're talking about, men in particular here as in part of this whole army series, women, of course, maybe we'll get to that as well. But to start with young men, they go through, like I would imagine any other person, they're in elementary school and there's high schools, obviously. And what's kind of the pathway for that person? And there are multiple pathways. And, some people are familiar with Hesder. We've discussed Hesder. In fact, there's now even a Haredi Hesder founded by Rabbi Carmi Gross. We've had him on the show and describe what that looks like. But there's also Mechina. There's people that are just learning, I think, for, an indefinite period of time. What are the different systems? How widespread are they? How, are people sort of tracked based on their high schools? How does it kind of work for the average young man in the Dati Chazak? There's all these different, terms, and Chardal and Torani. And so just give us kind of the overarching view of the society.
Thank you for the question. But my goal in life is to de-labelize, not to labelize. So
we got to know what they are before we can debunk them.
It's today's Thursday, so we just said Baruch Shmei together. So on my sitter, it says Ana Avda the Kutchav. Doesn't say Ana Avda with 5 multiple choice. Haredi, Yeshiva, Ana Avda Kutchav. So that's my.
You obviously have not been in Shidduchim lately, Rabbi Tarragon, because you're pretty much forced to choose one of those.
Right. Okay. But in terms of the tracks available, there are 4 different tracks. Israeli boys are a little bit more mature and autonomous, as girls are. They grow up faster. It's about a 1 to 1.5 year emotional gap, which means that my kids don't listen to me when they're 15. Americans wait to be 18. Part of the culture also. So the boys choose on their own. They're not really tracked. But the 4 options are as follows. One is direct army service, which is 3-year subscription. And keep in mind, I'm not sure Americans fully realize you get a very serious B'nai Torah. They view themselves as serious B'nai Torah. Where their tzitz is out, will sign up for 3 years of army service. In this culture, that is seen by many as the greatest method to serve our Mishpah. Again, my kids don't, so I'm not fully familiar with all these elements, but it's not a marker, that person's not going to yeshiva. Like maybe in America, someone does that and it doesn't have any yeshiva encounter, you maybe frame that person's development in a certain way, as indicated by the lack of yeshiva interest. It's true here to a degree, but it's not across the board. The Hesder well, let's in ascending order, not really ascending order, but then there's the Mechina program, which you spoke about before. The Mechina program was actually started by my Rebbe, Rav Amital, who started his own competition, because the Hesder program, which we'll speak about in a moment, which many people are less familiar with, was this large framework that didn't really suit the developmental needs of all the boys who weren't cut out for hard, intense learning. I remember when I was in yeshiva from 1983 to 1985, it's been a long time, but at least 30, 40% of the boys just didn't belong. But that was the only framework that was capable of helping them navigate these 5-6 years of their life. So in the late 80s, Rav Amital started what's called the Mechina, or he initiated, along with others, the Mechina concept, where there were boys who are not cut out for full-time learning. They are essentially on their way to the army to excel in the army. Let's provide them a year or two of basic, not the Havayis of Abaye Varava, not the Ktos and the Nesivos, not Shalosh Babos, but a lot of Emunah, a lot of Halacha L'Maisa, a lot of Machshava, in order to not just immunize them, but to empower them to remain committed and firm in the army. And the second part of that agenda was political. Because the army in Israel is a stepping stone for public leadership and public service, this is a way to infiltrate the army and then segue into greater influence in politics and in civic leadership. And you're seeing this, sadly, tragically, because this is a war in Israel. It's basically being fought by only two sectors. The Haredi sector is not participating. By and large, the secular sector has moved into much of the intelligence community and the Air Force in areas that are not direct combat. Combat fighters are essentially Yeshiva Bachim from the Dati Lumi world and Masaratim Sephardim from Ashkenazi. And you're seeing that in the death rates. You're seeing that in the names of the images. So this is the byproduct of what was started 30, 40 years ago, where we're so involved in the army and the upper ranks of the army. The third system you spoke about, most people are aware of, is Hesder. Hesder in Hebrew means an arrangement. Let's look there. The 5-year program, about 16 months of army service in between 2 and 2. Not really 2 and 2, 2 years of learning, 16 months of army service, and let's say a year and a half of learning. But a lot of boys stay on for 6, 7, 8, 9 years of solo. I think a lot of Americans are not aware. I think you ask most Americans how many Hesder programs are, they say 3 or 4. There are close to 85.
Wow. Yeah, they mean the ones that Americans go to. They mean Gush, Shalavim, and KBY, Kotel, baby,
Which, by the way, many of them, though they have strong overseas programs, they're not necessarily as central and mainstream popular Hesder code. It's very hard to pull off. Israelis don't want to learn with Americans. The more that you increase your American footprint, harder it is to attract people. Our competition in Israel is not with Kermiah and Shalavim. Our competition is with Malay Dumim and Yerucham and Alot Shaul and Othniel. And we lose, so to speak, a boy because we're too American. This place is no American. It's a very, very different space. And then there's what you said before. It's called Tarasoim Naso or Yeshiva Gavoa. Typically, they're called Rav Kook yeshivas. And yeshivas such as Har Bracha, Har Hamor, Merkaz, Beit El, Eli. In general, in Israel, in the Tilami world, as much as I dislike labels, my kids tell me people are labeled as either a Kavnik or Gushnik. Kav in Hebrew means a line. Line would suggest binaryism, where there's black and white, good and bad, endorsed, condemned. Whereas a Gushnik means not just people that learned in the Gush, but that were inspired by a lot of yeshivas that have been feeded or seeded by the Gush. A lot of Hezbollah yeshivas, his Rabbanim Rosh Yeshiva learned in yeshiva with me 40 years ago. More subtlety, more sophistication, more not black and white. Either way.
And also politically, that ends up being more of a moderating influence, right?
For sure. Well, right. The three differences, people sometimes will use the term Hardali to refer to Yeshivas. The differences would be moderate sophistication or black and white hardline, fundamentalists. Second is what type of women's education. You alluded to it before. Is it text-based or is it more hashkafa and identity building? And number 3 is, do you view the Western world as either irrelevant or toxic, or do you view the Western world, let's say, in the tradition of the celibate? It's not modern orthodoxy. People conflate modern orthodoxy with religious Zionism. Very, very, very different on many, many levels. But anyway, getting back to those 4 tracks, boys who enter those yeshiva will say, I'll just learn as long as I'd like to, or as long as I feel I can, and then I'll go to the army and I'll just sign up for whatever time I have on my ledger based on how old I am.
And are they getting the same tichuyim as people in Haredi yeshivas?
I don't think clerically you need a tichuy, because you're in a framework which funnels into the army. Everyone in that yeshiva will at some point serve in the army. So there may be some other form you fill out. The advantage of Hesder is you enter the army with your group. So the Talmid and my teacher have been to the army together. They made minyan together. They've coalesced together. They support one another together. The advantage of a Kabbalah approach is you just get to learn as long as you want. It's not one size fits all. So if I'm a stronger learner, I can learn for 3 or 4 years. If I'm a weaker learner, I can go a little bit earlier. So each has their merits and disadvantages. Those are the 4 traps that people find themselves in.
It's interesting that you're describing it. It sounds like this Kavnik versus Gushnik. The Kavniks basically sound, I guess that's what you call the Chardal, in a sense, right? That's basically sound almost the same as Haredim outside of the Eretz Yisrael or state, Medinat Yisrael, really, piece of things in terms of secular influences, call it, again, fundamentalist approach, which, again, whether that's a pejorative or not, but it is really striking to hear those things, that those similarities, as opposed to the Gush approach does sound more like, what do you call it, a centrist or YU model of at least habits of thought, habits of mind. Very, very interesting.
Again, I have a hard time with these terms.
I get it. I can see you're bristling viscerally at the generalizations, and I appreciate
my daughter. One of my daughters got for Shabbos. She married a boyfriend, Haramor. It's like they just opened a base medical club with 900 seats just 5-6 years ago. There was a lot of brouhaha. How could a Jewish girl marry a Haramor boy? And to be honest, some of his rebbeim boycotted the wedding. They didn't want to come. I was like laughing, like, I love him. He's my son-in-law. He's a doctor now. And like, you sit at our table, we barely can tell the difference between him and some of my other son-in-laws. So.
Yeah, I often joke. I mean, I'm involved in my, my main profession, quote unquote, is in Kira V'chokim. So most of my life, I'm engaged with people that you can't read Aleph Beis, and don't know Shabbos from Shavuos from, whatever. And so when I hear, like, when I go into this kind of, mind frame and the niching down of, microcosmic differences, I do sometimes step back and let how pedantic it is, but nonetheless, people do self-identify in these ways. And as we see, there are, say, in yeshiva nafkaminas, that are lamaisa, that are really practical in terms of what people actually do and how they translate that ideology onto the actual stage of life. So in that regard, I guess it's important to determine or understand where people are coming from.
But just before we go on, just because it's a phraseology, I try to encourage them to think about. You talked about the nafkaminos, I'll talk about it Sveidinim. Sveidinim and the Yeshiva Welt, for those of you who are listening, is very different categories. They say try to differentiate between identity and community. Your identity is to be an Oved Hashem. Now, you can't live by yourself and form a school for your kids by yourself and daven by yourself and have a victim for yourself. And you have to form a community with people of like-minded values. So, for example, if people ask me, am I a Dati Lomi Jew? I chafe with that. I'm an Oved Hashem, and in 200 years, no one will know what those terms are. But I live in 2024, and I need a school, and I need a yeshiva, and I need a shul. I happen to choose to live in a Dati Lomi community. I think that chilek between identity and community is a helpful way to try to wrap your head around.
I love that dichotomy. That's fantastic. I may begin appropriating that for myself. I will try. I will, in the spirit of maybe Lidei Geula, as we mentioned earlier, I'll try to attribute it, but forgive me if I don't. In the spirit of your Yochim B'Sezer Elio, maybe I won't. But in any event, so in sort of a meta sense, is there any kind of consensus or broad understanding that one particular track tends to be more successful in retaining young men's fervent observance, or is it really every person is different, or is it more of kind of Simon Siba, again, to use another kind of yeshivish parlance, depends on what they're coming in with, is kind of is what they're choosing the system based on who they are, and so that's going to anyway sort of prejudice the results on the other end. Is there a sense of you mentioned before that it's in a certain way a hierarchy, but it's not really a hierarchy, maybe it's seen as a hierarchy? Does one system tend to produce better, at least where you're sitting as a Rebbe, having seen many, many students through the years?
Look, it's a very good question. Excuse me for broadening a little, because you've touched upon something important that I think relates not just to what's happening on this side of the ocean, but on your side of the ocean. Well, let me take a step back. First of all, the comparison would be between Hesder and between Kabbalah yeshivas, because those are places that are Torah intense, that are dosed heavily in Talmud Torah. It would be unfair, as you implied, to compare boys that go to Cook yeshivas and go to Hesder yeshivas. So let's say boys that don't go straight to the army, and there's a self-selection. They're going straight to the army because their interest generally in Talmud Torah and Avodas Hashem at this stage in the classic way isn't as deeply grounded as the boys that are committed to Talmud Torah. And same thing with Mechina. So it wouldn't be fair to compare Hesder Yeshivos and Kav Yeshivos to Mechina and straight arm. I'll just take the Hesder and the Kav Yeshivos. Although what you do see, as you see in any world, is some of the boys that go to Mechina with less religious background, and they're a little bit more confused in high school, and they're less set in their ways, they're tabula rosas. And these are the people who become very, very stark and very firm and very committed in the army and in the Mechina, like in any setting. But in terms of the question of a more closed environment or more open environment, in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there was a very disparaging view of Western European Jewry by Eastern Europeans. Eastern European Jewry had all the top yeshivos and all the top rabbanim. And actually, Western Europe, Germany, France, England had to import their rabbanim from Eastern European yeshivos. And after World War I, tables turned, the script flipped, in part because the entire economic system collapsed, and Eastern European were at the bottom of the food chain. They were highly, highly dependent on Western European Jewry. In part because a lot of Eastern European Jews got caught in Western Europe. They had to actually live and meet these people. Cook, for example, from England in World War I. They actually met British Jews who admired. But more than anything else is in the early part of the 20th century, the reform, conservative, all the secular movements that started to ravage Orthodox commitment, they drove through Eastern Europe like a fire on a barrel. I mean, we have this glorified version of what was happening in Eastern Europe. How many people were in the great yeshivas? In the great yeshivas, they really supercharged Torah and Torah learning, maybe 5,000 at the height, maybe 6,000 at the height. For every one boy who made it to Volozhin and made it to Slobodka and made it to Mir and made it to less than 6 or 7 and walked out and just signed up University of Moscow, and signing your name at University of Moscow was tantamount to apostasy. You were just walking out. And what it did was it burst the bubble. Eastern Europe created a bubble. It was very insular and very protective. The second that bubble was pierced, there was no defense mechanism, no immunity. And Western European Jewry was able to withstand itself. It didn't defect as much, certainly in the 20th century, because it had already been exposed to the world. And that's the million-dollar question. How do you create enough exposure to create immunity and to create formulas that are durable enough to face the outside world without overexposing and corrupting? And I think that's a question that all the communities in America are dealing with right now. I'm terrified, to be honest, that Americans are creating a bubble that will come back. Not the bubble will come back, but the condition will collapse very quickly because the internet has barged down the doors. It's impossible to make doors. So you're creating a reality which there are doors in barricades, but they don't really exist. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I could sparkle. I'm dead wrong and I'm totally missing this. But there's a little bit of that in Eretz Yisrael where the Grushnik approach does encourage exposure to the world around you. The boys are reading, the boys are involved in a more sophisticated approach and accepting the world. And the Kavnik is a little more insular. The little that I can gather from speaking to my sons-in-law who learned in different yeshivos, I don't feel there's a material difference in how many boys. Here, it's not called OTD, it's called Choser B'Shelah. How many boys are Choser B'Shelah from a Grushnik approach? How many boys are Choser B'Shelah from the Kavnik approach? I'm told that essentially the statistics are more or less the same. Sad they're too high, but they're the same.
What is the, I guess, curriculum in any of these yeshivas, whether it's the Kavnikim, whether it's the Grushnikim, or the Hesder while they're in yeshiva? Is it identical or very similar to a Haredi yeshiva curriculum? Is there more emphasis, on Tanakh and Machshava, Eretz Yisrael, things like that? What's kind of maybe within those, there's a distinction as well. What is the typical curriculum?
Well, it's a good question. I'll start globally. What's common between them? I'll hone in on one or two of the differences. What's common between them, as you said, is even in the, let's talk about the yeshiva, the more yeshiva-oriented frameworks, the Kavnikim and yeshiva. Let's hold Mechina off on the side, because there the menu is almost dominated by Machshava, almost dominated. They'll learn Gemara, obviously. You don't want any boy to walk out without a grounding Gemara, but it's not the centerpiece as much as it would be in a more yeshiva setting. I would say there's much more of a revival of Machshava learning, whether it's Rav Kook in the Kavnik yeshivos, people like Rav Soloveitchik, and some of the younger, newer names. There is an emergent interest in people like Rav Shagar. I don't think Americans are that exposed.
Postmodern.
Steinsaltz or Chagall. So I think it's a little more prominent in the Hesder world, but I don't have that much experience in the Catholic Yeshiva world. And obviously much more of an attention to studying Tanakh, which is true of Israel in general. We feel that now we've returned to the land of history, so the book of history is much more compelling and much more relevant. And when I say learning Tanakh, I'm not talking about the typical old style, read the Pasuk, read Rashi, read Vidach, read them to this level, find out, but meta-analysis of reading Tanakh as if it were a book of literature, not in a way that trivializes God forbid or hollows it a Kedusha, but one level that Hashem wants us to read Tanakh, as if we don't, basically in the literary world, something called deconstructionism. You take words and you break them down into letters and you break them down. Basically, Chazal with deconstruction, where what's the extra letter and what's the double lashon and Dibur Lashon Bnei Adam and why does the Torah, in a good way, because of Kadosh Baruch Hu wrote the Torah's code. And in that deconstructionism, we've also lost the holistic reading. Reading text like if Abarbanel read it, others read it. So there's more of a return to that type of learning as well. I think if you walk into these yeshivos, primarily the difference would be an afternoon seder. An afternoon seder, instead of, let's say, Nacha Seder and Gemara, that third seder, some people will learn Gemara Halach L'Maisa, whereas some boys will spend some time, I don't know, maybe 4 hours a day thinking about yeshiva, learning Machshava, learning Tanakh with appropriate shiur. The differences between, ironically, the difference between some of the Gushnik and Kovnik yeshivos, in some ways, the Gushnik yeshivos are more reflective of the classic Alephine yeshivos. In other ways, they're different. They're more reflective in that the brisker impulse is felt more deep. If you walk into my shiur, you would feel, again, my style is a little different, but the day-to-day bread and butter, very similar to what you hear in the shiur and Miro, and shiur. Like when I tell people, listen to my shiur and like this, there's a common. Whereas Rav Kook wasn't, though I learned in Volozhin, Rav Kook wasn't a Lambda. He didn't encourage Lambdas. You ever see the Gemaras that were written that he wrote, Halacha Brura, it's very much Gemara, Rambam, Rush, Rambam, Halacha L'Maisa. Cook actually wrote a very famous letter in the 1920s. He wanted to build a new image of a yeshiva where the boys would study a lot of Tanakh, a lot of Machshava, and a lot of literature, and they would write, because in those days, if you had a pen, you could sway public opinion. And it's clear, listening to him describe his curriculum, that he's not expecting his boys to study Lambdas, because it takes me 7 hours to go through a sukkah, and all the Rishonim and all the Achronim. I don't have the time to then study Tanakh, study Machshava, and then also read. It was a very, and it's clear that he expected the boys to read the Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, Rosh, Beis Yosef, Rambam, Halacha L'Maisa, which more or less you could condense into a 2-3 hour session. On the other hand, I think that one of the, it's coming up now again, one of the big controversies, so to speak, between the Gersh world and the Tabnik world, again, it sounds quaint to people who are not part of either world, is whether Tanakh should be read for Dova Einayim. Dova Einayim is an Israeli expression, as if you're looking at it from your vantage point rather than just submitting your vantage. If I'm looking at it my vantage point, that's sin. But Chazal told me, so do I submit that? I say, okay, Chazal had one message. And the fact that it was written in a way that implies it, he said, there's another message you take away without in any way detracting or hoping. Obviously, it's more perilous, detracting from the halo and the sanctity of these great epic figures. That's always a big debate. And a lot of the anti-Gush, Rabbi Tau, I don't know if you've heard of Rabbi Tau, he is one of the most vehement Parshas Pinchas. He's the Pinchas of the Tabnik world, and he never misses an opportunity to obsess about this issue. And I understand that in his mind, if this is taken too far, it can significantly undercut the way we respect these people, and of course, by extension, the way we respect ourselves. I understand that
that's kind of like the psychological analysis. Sometimes, what was Avram Avinu thinking, and those kinds of sort of people accuse it of projection and or of lack of reverence and that kind of an approach.
Right, and for sure, it's a fair point. Like everything, it's a fair point. You have to make sure that you guard against the excesses and guard against the overskill. But if it's done in a proper way, I think it would be very nice.
You mentioned that you've been on these panels before, where kind of each of you and Jonathan Rosenblum were kind of extolling the virtues of each other's communities. I'm curious what some of the virtues that most impress you, I guess, in the Haredi world today, in the contemporary world, whether Israeli Haredi, American Haredi, and then conversely, if you could assume his position for a minute, what do you think the Dati world is doing very, very well that the more yeshivish sector could learn from? Again, not necessarily in a position of giving musar, but just to raise the awareness of some of the features?
Well, look, it's a very charged question, and I just want to let me take this opportunity. We're at a point in which there are very, very sharp divisions between the two communities. And the stakes aren't just ideological, the stakes are, unfortunately, paid in part, and paid in a lot of heartache. And before the end of the show, my daughters are going through the third round in middle age. Third round of having your husband away from your kids and facing your kids alone and suffering and crying and panic attack and with more soldiers. So it's not an ideological issue, it's a human tragedy. That tragedy is a human issue. So every comment that I have here should be framed by the fact that this is a very difficult moment, and I don't think that the discourse is helped by broad, fanatical, wrong, emphatic. The real issues there, and we as a community have to find a way to navigate them. Not all of them will have the answers in the immediate sense. And hopefully with what Berkeley's help, we'll find a way to steer the two communities together and find common solutions. But getting back to your question, I just want to enter that question without giving that framing. Look, the Haredi approach is essentially to build a pyramid. Whose apogee is Talmud Torah. And everything on the pyramid, every resource in society, every attitude is sloped towards Harbatz's stuff. The girl is indoctrinated from an early stage that her mission in life and her costume in life is to somehow one day marry someone who will be guts and learning, and to be learning all day, and that's what she wants to marry. And the entire communal ethos and the goal. I mean, it's almost parallel to this. Now there's been a lot of talk about the Rebbe. So you see how that community is sloped towards shlichus. Everything is shlichus. And from a young age, the highest achievement is not Talmud Torah. The highest achievement is to go to Kathmandu and open up a Chabad house and deeply inspire you or anyone who comes into your orbit. And the amount of Torah and Torah commitment, Torah values, are just Talmud. I mean, see in my room, I'm not going to pull a psalm off the shelf, but how many psalms that are being printed in Bnei Brak because of that massive investment in Talmud Torah, which is essentially, in many ways, an offshoot of Yeshiva World. I feel I'm also an offshoot of Yeshiva World if you're watching in here, but in their ideology, in their view, they're the direct descendants of that movement that entered the Ashkenazi world, not the starting world, and essentially poured jet fuel on Eish Torah. In collaboration and copyright. I'm also deeply impressed, more so by Israeli Haredim, with the level of idealism and selflessness. I mean, it's hard to live a Haredi lifestyle. It's easier to live in Baltimore and Passaic and have an SUV and shop in Walmart and go to the Yankee game. And, I don't want to give labels, but it's not a Haredi lifestyle in the day-to-day. It's sociologically Haredi. Yes, how you identify with people you listen to. But day-to-day, you're not living in a room with 13 kids and going on buses. Just the willingness to go to the mat and sacrifice comfort and personal pleasure for a higher goal from the Torah. It's selflessness, it's idealism, it's passion, it's sacrifice, and it's just very impressive to see people who orient their lives that way. They know they're going to live a life of poverty, and they're willing to embrace it and to struggle with it. It's a real struggle. And I'm sure it has its disadvantages. I'm sure there's an ugly side to it, and I'd be happy to share it. That's not the purpose of a community that creates essentially poverty as an ethos. Essentially, or financial struggle as an ethos. But it's just impressive at a human level to see people. And I ask myself, am I willing to show the same use to this and my lane when I have ideals that I can. So those are the two. The third thing that strikes me, which is pretty much a codicil or a corollary. The third is the value placed on family. And in the Haredi world, the entire universe surrounds family. Family, I think a lot of people outside of the Haredi world don't appreciate. What do you mean? How could you just have your family set up the shidduch? How could you have your parents? Because in that world, family is more important than romance, because that's your identity. So if the person fits into your family, you love that person, even if you aren't as emotionally attracted or physically attracted as, let's say, you would want as a precondition for marriage in the same community that I live in. So the way in which family is revered, the way in which a family unit continues to remain the fulcrum or the pivot of identity, you don't get married and leave your family. You get married and you continue to live with your family, in part because financial need, in part because family replaces. Why is there so much chesed in the Haredi world? Because there's more need. If I need, let's say, an item, I'll go to the store and buy it. If a Jew in Malat, B'Shem, Aleph, or Gimel, whatever, needs something, he can't afford it, so he'll open up a gemach book and he'll find a place as long as a pair of glasses or a screwdriver or a computer or whatever he needs. So it generates chesed, it generates family. Those are some of the values that I, as an outsider, I'm sure there are more values than many other phrases, but as an outsider, if I could just capture some of this lightning in a bottle and bring it over to my world, would be that I can't, because in my world there's a pantheon of values. So I can't recreate the commitment to Talmud Torah once you introduce a larger menu of values. I call it the Shimon Peres effect. I want to call it Shimon Peres effect. When Shimon Peres died a few years ago, he was eulogized and lauded, and he was a hero of the Jewish people. Gibor Yisrael, as they say in my community. So I'm a mature enough person to know that he excelled in one value that's part of our puzzle that's not the top value. That value is committed to the Jewish people. If you're 16-year-old boys or girls struggling with identity, and you hear the community celebrating Shimon Peres as a hero, well, I can also be a hero, even if I'm not Orthodox. And I can also be a hero if I commit to the Jewish people and serve in the army. So it's a much more binary system. If already either you learn or you're a second-class citizen, with all the advantages that produces. In our community, there are many different routes to being over Hashem. We hope that you can take all those values and assemble them in order they've been properly. It doesn't always happen. That's in terms of the Haredi community. Maybe you want to, before I speak too blankly, you want to respond to that.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to that, and I certainly agree with your observation in the the American Haredi world, where it's kind of like paying in some way lip service to that ideology while living a sort of bourgeois existence. And sometimes I think that there's a sense of displaced guilt that American Haredim will, and this is a total armchair analysis here, but why is there so much, let's say, material support for the Israeli Haredi lifestyle when that lifestyle actually disapproves of much of what I am actually doing in my day-to-day life? Well, maybe it's a sense that really that's the pinnacle, that is the apex. I personally can't, measure up to it, but at least I can support it in some way, whether that means moral support, and rhetorical support or financial support. That may or may not be true, but it's something that struck me, especially on the recent, mission that was the delegation that came here of many great rabbonim to raise all this money and to perpetuate a system which, to many American Haredim, is actually not a system that they rely on or could rely on, or in many ways they would find it anathema, and yet very much you believe in perpetuating in any way possible and continuing to do so. I think there's a lot of interesting psychological aspect to that. But yeah, I think there's no question that when you're single-mindedly focused on a particular value, your likelihood of producing results, in that arena are very, very high. And of course, there are negative potential associated effects with that as well, where people can feel, if they can't measure up to that, they can feel like, as you said, second-class citizens. I think the Haredi world has evolved to try to address that in ways and create other frameworks. But at the end of the day, the ultimate value is the ultimate value. And, that can't be understated. I guess, what do you think the Haredi society can really draw from Dati Leumi society, especially in as much as you're telling me there's a different approach to panoply of values as opposed to a singular primary value, ultimately leading, of course, I guess there's really one overarching value, which is serving Hashem, but the way that is achieved, if there are these different ways of looking at it, is there something the Haredi society, nevertheless, even within its framework, could pull from the Dati Leumi world?
That's a really hard question for me to tackle, because you're asking me to step into the eyes of a Haredi person and look at myself. So there's a lot of, it can also come across as, God forbid, self-triumphalism, beating your chest, and this is what you have to do. The first part is easier. I can look at a different community from my own eyes and then realize and admire. It's very, very, very good.
I'm glad you're saying that's the easy part. I think most people have it reversed today. The easy part is telling the others. So,
look, I think that there's a lot of faith and courage in our community, and there's a lot of movement. And when you hear people speaking at Levios, people whose lives are broken, bursting forward in very, very impressive ways. I think the myth of Miskat and Hadaros is that an overarching doctrine of every generation is more than it applies to the Masar. An American argue with the Tana, And Rishon can argue with an Amora and Achon, because the Masara is a transmission from Har Sinai, and the closer to Har Sinai you are, the more accurate it is. Further from Har Sinai. It probably also applies to general moral behavior, because we believe that Dvar Hashem affects our level of piety. It's not just the study of documents. But we assume they're the greatest tzaddikim in earlier periods. And it doesn't mean that in every single detail, generation X plus 1 is less than generation X. And I think that this is a door of the moon. Look at the generation. And just, I think about the Dor Shema, the people in their life. Think about what they went through. They were mostly nefesh and Kiddush Hashem. They were mostly nefesh to defend what they thought in a very, very dark world, fighting the Roman Empire. You think we have that? We're just fighting second-rate countries like the Houthis and Hamas and Iran. They were facing the Roman Empire. It's not an easy task. And I think that just the emphasis on Emunah, the emphasis on how that creates an interface with the Kodesh Baruch Hu, it doesn't have to be built solely upon the Kussos and the Rashba and the Kidega. And with all of that brings a level of intimacy with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. In broad, very, very, very broad strokes, we believe that obviously there are two pistons that drive our relationship with Rebbeinu Shalom. One is Ahavas Hashem, one is Yiras Shamayim. And in general sense, Ahavas, when you feel close to Rebbeinu Shalom, if you're a partner with him, you feel intimate, you talk to him, like in Chassidus, we always stress that. In Yiras Shamayim, as you realize the distance, of Lo Machshavos and Machshavosechem, but Da'atchem B'Rafai. Golus, obviously, emphasizes Yiras Shamayim. That's the fun, you don't understand Da'atchem Hashem. Geula obviously stresses Ahavas Hashem, because you feel like you're part of Rebbeinu Shalom and tables of history return. In a broad sense, the more that you perpetuate the Golus, not in a pejorative way, I think just the Haredi approach is the preservation of traditional society. It's preserve what we have, but more or less slight adaptations. 1948 without a ship, the Holocaust was on a ship, whatever the period. We're essentially back in Volozhin, back in Slobodka, and I feel the Yiras Shamayim is very deep there, missing from our community. I feel a lot of people are too comfortable with Hashem. I just wrote an article. I read a weekly article for the OU. It was on Parshas Pinchas, and I talked about having Hashem's name as part of your Mishpacha, I talked about names throughout Jewish history and the de-Judaization of names in Spain, and the de-Judaization with Happy Now, though back in Israel, many people wanted to Hebraicize them. So Ben Gurion was Gruen, and Ben Gurion, and Begin was something else. And I talked about how in our world now people are starting to name their children literally from Parshas Pinchas, names that have conjugation of Hashem's name. Da'el, Matanel, and Immanuel, and Imael, and Yeshuel. And I think it's indicative of the fact that we feel very comfortable with the Banashal, and we're going to call ourselves with his name. And I feel there's more of that Ahavas Hashem at the cost of Yiras Hashem. It needs to be a little bit more circumspect, respect, distance, and awe. We don't know the Da'atchem Hashem. And have your dad Da'asal thinking. In the Haredi world, I think there needs to be a little more of that intimacy with the Banashal comes across. If anything, Torah, the Talmud Torah, there's an old expression, and I'm sure you know from the yeshivas, because in your yeshivas and my yeshivas, he worships the Shulchan Aruch, not a Kodesh Baruch. So there's this interface that's in the Chaim Volozhin's manner is supposed to be, of course, the Kodesh Baruch Hu B'Orais V'Chayhu, but it's easier said than done. Sometimes it becomes more about Orais and less about a Kodesh Baruch. So I think that there's a lot of emunah in our world. And then there's an issue which I think is not something that the Haredim want to take from our world. I would like them to. I think there's a fundamental difference in how you view secular science. You view them either as in suspended animation waiting for Mashiach or worse. Like I think some people will say, and I've heard them say this, they're the fourth-fifths that died in Mitzrayim. Just like in Golos Mitzrayim, fourth-fifths died, similarly, when Mashiach comes, they're going to die, and you and I, Hashem, will be nearby. I don't subscribe to that. And even people will find that to be too harsh. Essentially, right now, there's nothing of value in their lives and nothing of value in their attitudes. And therefore, if I'm Aryeh Deri, or if I'm a Rebbe in Yeshiva, I will press whatever agenda serves my constituents' needs, regardless of how it affects their attitude towards Torah and towards B'nai Torah. Because they're bankrupt. They may be condemned to die, or at the very least, they're religiously bankrupt. So why should I shape my policy about yeshivas, about serving in the army, based on their reaction? I don't care about their reaction because they're not part of the game right now, the ideological game. Whereas in my world, they're part of the system. There's inherent value to them as being Yidden, based on Hasidus, based on Mabai, based on the original Rebbe, based on the values they show. And therefore, as the Gemara says in Kiddushin, and my Rebbe with Aaron will quote this often, if the Am is Makib B'no Gadol, the father is his adult child, he's over with neither, because he has to anticipate the response. So I feel that I have to meter my policies, not just based on what's right, but based on how it's going to impact secular Jew and Polish type. Now, I would like Haredim to adopt that view because I believe in it, but L'Shitasam, I don't think they would. I think L'Shitasam would say, okay, we'll use more Moon and more Al Hashem. But L'Shitasam, it's not fair. So I said before, it's a hard question because I don't think they concede that initial move on the chessboard. I don't think they concede that there's real value in the mind place of a secular view. And that's, I think, a real deep existential question that then has nafkaminos and parallels across the board. Army service, and if you really believe that they're part of the game, part of the system, then you want to serve with them, and you want to live with them, you want to influence them. If you believe that they're just suspended until Mashiach comes, then you follow your agenda, regardless of how it impacts them. And that to me is the real aviyavosa chilukim.
So many threads I could pick up on there, and there's so many more topics I'd love to speak to you about, but we're short on time. I just want to ask you a final question, which is, let's take away the Israeli Haredi population for a minute, because if I would ask you, what do people in your community want to see from the Haredi world? I mean, it's pretty basic. I think they'd want them to serve. I think that's pretty straightforward, whatever that means. And I'm sure there's different, some people would say tomorrow, and some people would say start a process that would move them that direct. I'm sure there's many ways that people would potentially modulate that answer, but that would probably be the overarching answer. However, what if you look towards the American Haredi population, the Anglo, outside of Israel? Is there something that the Dati community would want to see or would be energized by seeing? I guess Aliyah perhaps would be one, but other than that, is there a way to express appreciation? Is there something that they're looking for from the American or the diaspora Jewish community that would be of value, of meaning, of inspiration to that community?
Your question presumes that people in the Dati Leumi community understand that there is an American Haredi community. Most of the people here have no English background, which, by the way, is a majority. I know when people come from Passaic and from Lakewood to Israel, they hang out in the Inbal Hotel and they go to the restaurants and meet all the Anglos. And boy, there's a one big, for a very, very, very small part of the population, very minuscule. So, like, my kids assume there are a couple of Yidden living in America. Maybe they're lucky if they have some kosher food and some stale kosher food, some osin, soup nuts. Maybe they're lucky if they can build a shul or two. They have no clue. But I believe that the war has created a bit of a sea change. I think the war will continue to shift Jewish peoplehood and Jewish identity across the Jewish world. I don't think anyone will be the same after the war. It may happen in a month, it may happen in a couple of months. And I think that most of what you call it the Haredi American community, I call it the Jewish community, just to create difference between Haredim in Israel and the Jewish people in America. I think that there's a movement to acknowledge, I mentioned this before, I'm writing a book on Gula, and I believe that 80% of Am Yisrael believes in 80% of the same things about where we are in history. And I think that there's a movement that the Haredi world understand that without Eretz Yisrael, there is no Jewish survival. And without defending and participating in the process, we're going to lose Eretz Yisrael. And I don't think that secular Judaism can be vilified anymore, because these are the people, secular Jews in Israel, who defended the land and died for the land. And you can't attend the funerals and call them kadosh, and then the next day you sit there and doing that. And I believe that you take out all of the noise about racist bichatz saying, yes saying hallow and no saying hallow, is Mashiach coming tomorrow or not? Take all that upper crust off, and you just get to the core. We are at a moment in history. We're moving forward. Excuse me for stealing the microphone. When people ask me to describe where we are in history, because I want to make it vague, I don't like using the term racist bichatz because that already assumes certain things and everyone's going to accept. I call it the fourth growth. Jewish history is divided into four periods. First 2,500 years before Har Sinai, the next 1,300 years of Malchus Yisrael, and Gilui Shechina, and Nisim, Hashgacha Pratis, 2,000 years of Golos, and now we're in the fourth room of history. And that fourth room of history is It could take us 100 years, it could take us 500 years. But I think that most Yidden would say we're in the fourth room. Things have changed. Yidden are Eretz Yisrael, call it kibbutz Galias, don't call it kibbutz Galias. We know that things are changing. And part of that change is we have to start readjusting and calibrating where we are. And we're all in the fourth room. Some of us feel like we're walking through with the flower, which is and some people don't like that thing. Not a big deal. All in that room together. I think that people understand that more than ever before. They've been awakened out of their older. Eretz Yisrael used to be a place you could land for Yom Tov, and have a second day minion, buy your apartment, send your kids to learn. Now it's something that's existential, part of the identity. And I think it's a major, major shift.
Rabbi Moshe Tarragon, a beautiful way to end. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and Hatzlacha and all of your attempts to be Marbit Sarah. Amen.
Amen.
Well, Joe.